want to talk about how the culture takes us to the end of the age.
Yeah, that's a good point. Um, yeah, the end of the world, the end of the age, the last days is a pretty hot button topic and has been for years and years and years. Um, Recently, we talked about some passages of Scripture in 2 Timothy. There's some found in chapter 3 and some found in chapter 4. I want to share a little bit of those with you tonight. But right there in the beginning of chapter 3 in 2 Timothy, Paul writes, "But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People are going to become lovers of themselves. They're going to be lovers of money. They'll be boastful, proud. They'll be abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous. They won't have self-control. They'll be brutal, not lovers of good. They're treacherous, rash, conceited. People will be lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God." And you hear all that and you think, yeah, that's pretty much the world we live in. That's all around me everywhere. But to me, the scariest thing is what he writes next. Verse 5, after having described the horrible attitudes and the way people will be and what they'll act like and how they'll think and their whole mindset, he says they'll have a form of godliness but denying its power. And I think, well, wait a minute. A form of godliness means that he's talking about people who
could be in the church.
Yeah, they're religious people, could be sitting in the church. You know, this is not the guys who are out there in the gangs and the people that are mowing folks down on the street necessarily, but these are people that will have some kind of claim to a religion or some kind of claim to a belief system. And like you said, they could be right in the church.
Right.
As a matter of fact, I think that's exactly what Paul's addressing. He's saying, you know, these are the folks that we'll really need to worry about. This is what's really going to happen is these are people that are right here in the church. They have a form of godliness. You know, they talk about church, they talk about values, and they talk about all these good things, but they don't know the power of godliness. And the power of godliness is Jesus Christ. He's the only power of godliness. And Paul writes again, I'm going to go on over to chapter 4 and read for you something that he writes that really just goes right along with this. And it starts with verse 3 there. He's talking to Timothy again in chapter 4. He says, "For the time will come when people won't put up with sound doctrine." Okay, once again, he's got to be talking and addressing primarily the church here. He says, "Instead, to suit their own desires, they're going to gather around them a great number of teachers, obviously false teachers, who are to say things that their itching ears want to hear." Some people have said that will tickle their ears, okay? Right. To say things they want to hear. You know, like, hey, you're good and God loves you and you're really a good person. There's a lot of good inside all of us and we're all God's children, which is a huge lie. We're not all God's children. We are all created by God, but we're not God's children until we accept Christ and become adopted into the family. And, you know, that's just a subtle little thing that Satan uses. He uses subtle lies like that because that sounds good. I mean, everybody wants to hear we're all God's children. And because God is love and we're all God's children. And he takes and twists the truth in such a way that it sounds plausible. It sounds like something that we will easily believe. The other half of the problem, though, is we want to hear that.
Right.
We want to hear, oh, I'm God's child. It's all good.
That's the culture.
Absolutely.
Comfort me. Comfort me.
Absolutely. And when you talk about culture, just to kind of take just a second to define what we mean when we use that term, because that can be thrown around a lot. But when we talk about culture, what we're talking about is kind of the collective worldview, okay? The collective mindset. And we all tend to adopt different ways of thinking, and we have our own unique ways of thinking, but the reality is we're very corporate in our thinking as well. And the culture represents who we are as a collective group or as a corporate group. Right. You know, what we think about certain things, what our values are in a corporate sense.
What we tolerate. You know,
absolutely. Absolutely. And it's kind of, it's an ever-changing thing, but it does seem like it's moving in a particular direction. So I think that's why your question, your topic tonight is awesome, and right on target, is because I believe that when we think about how we're going to get there for these last days, the very end of times, and how the world's going to end, I think that we're going to ride piggyback on the back of the world. I think the church is going to ride piggyback on the back of the world.
Right.
And part of the reason I say that goes right along with what Paul said to Timothy here. He said, there's going to come a time when people don't want to hear the truth. And that's people in the church. And we see that all around us. People don't want to hear the truth. They don't want to hear, they want to hear a message about sin. Several people have even said, surveys have been done where people will say, I don't really want to go to church and hear about sin. I want to go to church and hear about the love of God. And I want to be encouraged. And I want to be lifted up. And while that's good, okay, because, right here in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2 says that Timothy is to rebuke and encourage. So absolutely there needs to be encouragement. Absolutely there needs to be patience and instruction. But they need to both be present. I can't just continue to puff you up and build people up and say,
you wouldn't grow anything.
You're never going to grow. Exactly. If I just keep... we have to have the rebuke as well as the encouragement. And people don't want to hear the rebuke. They want to hear, hey, you're okay, I'm okay. That's what they want to hear. They want to hear everything is good. And I guess that's kind of natural. I don't necessarily like hearing bad things about myself, but I know it's necessary. I don't want to hear them because somebody's trying to tear me down. On the contrary, I actually want to hear criticisms or realities about myself because I believe somebody's trying to build me up.
Right. Our Father, who functions as our heavenly Dad, And I think it's fascinating that Paul uses the word perilous times because my generation thinks meteors, earthquakes, sea, but no, he's talking about the tiny things that add up and infect everything, boasting, covetousness, just being a mean, malicious person, not having, those just godly thoughts and trying to be holy, just accepting whatever and fluffing everything up. That's almost just as perilous as meteors and earthquakes because it has the ability to affect a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it's probably even more perilous because one of the things is, if I told you that a meteor was heading this way, we would all unite and get together and try to figure out some way to keep it from happening because we'd all be against that. Everybody's against that. But when we talk about people's attitudes and people's mindset and people ignoring the truth and more and more things becoming acceptable, that's way more dangerous. When you talk about countering the culture, what you're talking about is going against what is acceptable by the masses. We mentioned that the definition of a culture was what the vast majority of people corporately believe. And, I'm old enough now to have seen a lot of changes in what is acceptable in our culture. And I'll be honest and be the first to say that some of the things that we thought and believed 40, 50 years ago and we have changed on have been for the better. But there's also a lot of things that have changed and we now believe that are much for the worse. Okay? We've moved away from God's standard. We've moved away from what He says is the truth. A very hot topic right now in our culture today is marriage in general. Okay, the whole idea of marriage in general, and it's being looked at from being redefined. Essentially, we think about same-sex marriage and we think about different things, but the reality is it's even broader than that. It's marriage in general is being redefined. It's not just same-sex marriage, but it's get married, get divorced, get married, get divorced, get married, get divorced. It's no big deal. That's a redefinition. I know divorce has been around for years and years and years. I understand that, but it is much more accepted today. It's much more looked upon as it just didn't work out, and that's a change. That's a different mindset than 40, 50 years ago. There was a different way of looking at divorce 40 or 50 years ago, and so we think about the topic of marriage, and we think about how it's being redefined. We talk about how people, you know, will have the mindset of living together and not being married and saying, well, you know, you gotta try it out before you do it. It's like, well, that wasn't that way 40, 50 years or 100 years ago, or whatever you want to use as a time frame.
Right.
And none of that happened overnight. And that's one of the things that, going back to your point, that it being more dangerous than the media or
because where does the redefining stop?
It doesn't.
Right, and that's what brings us to the end of the age. You know?
Right.
Because what happens when we've redefined so many things that we don't know how to get back to ground, zero?
Yeah, we won't even know where ground zero is.
Right.
We will have moved so far from that mark that we don't know where it is. I mean, people, what Paul described in chapter 3, that doesn't happen right away. That happens over time. You know, when I was in high school, there was a huge news story about a homosexual teacher, somebody who was a teacher at a school, and they confessed and admitted they were homosexual. And the news story was, should they be allowed to teach in the school? Now, people can argue the merits one way or another, and that's not my point right at the moment. My point is, when I was in high school, that was the incredible pushing the envelope.
Right.
Now
It's snowballed.
It's snowballed, and there's nothing to indicate that it stops. And so we don't just jump from this point to this point. We gradually move there, and that's how Satan works on us. You know, we're all afraid. Again, we're all afraid of that meteor, or probably, you know, from a more humanistic standpoint, we're really afraid the end of the world's going to come because we're all going to nuke each other. You know, we're less afraid of that natural disaster than we are each other, and we're afraid, oh, you know, we're gonna destroy the earth. People are going to destroy the earth with these nuclear bombs or whatever weapon comes next, or biological weapon or something of that nature.
But meanwhile, that sleight of hand is very slow, and it's never going to stop. You know?
Exactly, and I think that's a great point. Is that we may blow up the world with nuclear bombs. I don't know. It may happen. But while we're all focused on that, like you said, that sleight of hand is taking place, where we move a little further to this side, you know, we move a little further away from God's standard, and then a little further away from God's standard, and a little and it's like, it's, you know, the old story of putting the frog in the pan of water,
right.
Okay, and you put him in there, and he's like, that's not so bad. And you turn the heat on, and you slowly warm the water up, and the frog's like, that's not so bad.
And that's how lies work.
It's exactly
and
how
the master of lies has been doing this lie for a really long time.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, he's got us all worried about nuclear weapons, and what he's doing is he's actually messing up inside, turning up the heat.
You know?
He's messing our inside up, and he's making us much more boastful. And again, all those characteristics that Paul talks about, and I look at it and say, having the form of godliness, and I'm like, wow, it's not the world that's the problem. It's the church.
Right, because there comes a point where you can't tell the Christians from the culture.
Oh yeah,
which is scary.
Yeah, and you know, if you know you preach sin or teach sin or say something about sin and you offend me, I'm going to leave. I'll just leave your church. I'll leave. Okay, and then our response in turn to that is, well, I can't afford to have people leave, so what I have to do is I have to adapt my message so that I never offend anybody. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not out there trying to offend people. That's not the point. For me, that is wicked and wrong. When you are purposely speaking in order to offend or tick someone off or hurt someone, that is so wrong. Okay, but when you speak the truth and you preach God's standards, it's going to offend some people. It's going to happen because we're sinners and we get offended when we hear the truth. And so we have responded to, well, I'm just going to leave and I'm going to leave your church. And it's like, oh, no, you can't leave the church. It'll die. We've responded by adapting our message and adapting what we preach and adapting who we are to make sure people remain comfortable.
Comfortable and entertained, you know?
Absolutely. And we're the frog in the water. And we keep adapting. And the sad thing is, the Bible tells us that the world is supposed to adapt to God's message. instead of us adapting God's message to the world.
Exactly.
We're doing it all
We're
backwards.
trying to add to it and do all those redefining, and
Right.
it's not how it's supposed to go.
And you know, and it's not just how we conduct the church in order to build the church, it's how we live as people of the church out in the world. You know, I can have conversations with you about certain values. I can have conversations with you about the marriage issue and about abortion and about other topics like this, and not feel any threatened at all because I know you have similar values. Okay, so it's not going to be a big deal. I'm not going to hack you off, and you're not going to go storming out the door. Okay, right. Or you're not going to make fun of me or call me some idiot or you know, do whatever to me. But when I get with someone who doesn't have those same values, I tone it down. And while there's some validity in how you approach people, the reality is I'm not doing it necessarily to speak the truth in love. What I'm doing a lot of times is I'm protecting me. I don't want you to dislike me. I don't want you to think I'm a weirdo. You know, the Bible says I'm a peculiar person, but I don't want you thinking so. You know, I don't want you to think that. I don't want you to make fun of me. I don't want to be ostracized. I don't want to be the guy, you know, that's left out of the group. We think of guys like John Wesley and some of those guys preaching years ago. Wow, man, they were great. The stuff they did, they preached out in the street, and it was awesome. And you know how awesome that is. And we think of them as the great people of preaching and so forth. But we don't think about the fact that a lot of those guys were, as they were preaching, the crowd was throwing rotten fruit at them and rotten vegetables at them, literally, and just bombarding them. Would we be willing to be that person today? No. Right. We're not willing to be that person.
And the kids my age that are sitting in college are sitting next to someone who's looking at, you know, all the social media, and they have like thousands of people who follow them because of, you know, they have similar beliefs. So what happens when you follow Jesus, who has 12 guys, pretty average dudes, just hanging out with him all the time? You know, that's 12 people, you know, and it looks like, well, he wasn't very popular, you know, blah, blah, blah. And that's goofy, but if you really think about it, you know, it's all about me, and
absolutely,
the Bible's not about you.
And Jesus experienced that too, because he had, at one point in time, he had a bunch of people following him, and he starts talking to them about some pretty radical stuff, and he said, you know, if you're going to follow me, you're going to have to eat my body, you're going to have to drink my blood. And people are like, whoa, you are off, you're off of it here. And it says there that they left him. Many people left him. And he turned to his 12 and he said, you leaving too? You know, because the crowd's all left. Well, we don't want that to happen with us. We want to fit into the crowd. And that, fitting into the crowd, that is going along with the culture. That is not countering the culture. Countering the culture says, I know what's right, and I'm going to do it regardless of what anybody else says. I'm going to do what's right, and I'm going to stand for what's right. No matter what the cost, no matter what it takes, I'm going to do what's right. And unfortunately, like I said earlier, the church is going to ride piggyback on the back of the world, or the culture, to the end of the world. That's how it's going to end. We're going to get so comfortable and so complacent that we won't recognize what godliness looks like. We won't know what it looks like. And that's where we're going. If we continue to follow the culture as the church, that's where we're headed. It's time to turn around. It's time to swim upstream.
It is. I always think of football when you say the word counter, like when you're a running back and you run the counter to the weak side. Everyone's going this way. Yeah. And you counter it, you know. That's how I kind of visualize it.
Yeah. So what can we do?
Well, I think it goes back to, you know, Jesus say, be the salt and the light of the earth. We have to preserve, you know, our roots. We have to get back to just basics. I think, especially me, I think about this all the time, you know. I'll find myself reading really, you know, deep Bible study stuff, and then I'll forget to like pray or something that night. You know, you have to kind of stop sometimes and just do the basic little things, you know. Mm-hmm. Just like we were talking about, like Paul's talking about these, you know, negative attributes of, you know, the people in the end times, but those are little things, you know, just respecting your parents and being a nice person and all that. So I think we just have to get back to basics and kind of ask ourselves, what does it mean to be a Christian? How am I supposed to be different? What am I supposed to look like compared to someone who's in the culture, you know? So you kind of have to stick out. You have to be a light in the world, and you kind of just have to go back. People need to pick up their Bibles You know, I think it's fascinating that they call the Bible the sword. You know, they refer to it as a sword.
Sure.
When you think of a sword, you don't think like, oh, ha ha ha, like look at that sword. You think of like war, and you think of
it's a vicious instrument.
Right. I mean, even the Greeks had that two-edged sword, and it, you know, we all know what that did.
It's a vicious instrument.
It's a vicious book too if you use it correctly, because it can change you and it can conform you.
Yeah, the Word of God is sharper than that two-edged sword.
Exactly.
And it cuts us. It divides us if we let it.
And we need to get back to our weapon, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I think another thing we need to do is we need to make a decision, and that is, are we willing to do what's right no matter what the cost? You know, are we willing to choose Jesus no matter what it will cost us? I don't claim to know what it will cost any individual, me, you, whatever. Okay, but I know that there is a cost to following Jesus.
And he tells us that.
He tells us that
himself.
Times. Yeah, and Paul said, you know, it's not me who lives. It's Christ who lives within me. And are we willing to be that? Are we willing to do that? I mean, that guy, he got thrown in jail. He got beaten. You know, he went through so much. But he got right back up and he stayed at it. Are we willing to do that? And right now, we're not. As a church, we're not. And I'm not saying we go out, again, I'm not saying we go out and look for a fight. But I'm saying we go in the direction of Jesus. And I'm guaranteeing you that's going to take us head on with the rest of the culture, because they're going in the direction without Jesus. I read the other day, somebody was talking about the fact that in many of our churches today, what we've done is we've decided to make the church scene look a lot like the club scene.
Yeah.
Okay? Because that's how we'll get people in. And the writer said, have we considered the fact that while we're making it easy to move from the club scene to the church scene, we're at the same time making it just as easy to move from the church, did I say it wrong?
Church scene to the club scene.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you're not, there's no difference.
Yeah, we've made it easy to move from the club to the church, and as we bring them together, it's just as easy to move from the church to the club.
And it's fascinating too. When I was little, I used to look up to coaches and things like that. And now it's like kids don't look up to righteous people. They look at them as boring people. They look up to, you know, rappers and actors and people who are very, very popular in the culture, you know?
Right.
So we have all these culture icons who don't represent, the majority of them don't. I mean, there's probably a few.
There's exceptions, sure.
You know, it's just different how the values have sort of changed. You know?
Right.
So these kids are growing up just younger and younger with more information in their pocket. You know, my sister's 11 years old, has an iPhone. I didn't have a phone until I was 18. You know what I mean? So it's like now all of this knowledge is at the click of a button.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, who are our heroes today? Would Moses be one of our heroes? Would Paul be a hero? No. It's the person who drives the Ferrari. It's the person who drives the Maserati. It's the person who drives the Vet or whatever it is, you know. It's the person with the mansion. You know, those are our heroes today. Our heroes are not the people like Paul or, you know, John or truthfully, would Jesus be our hero today? Probably not. Yeah. And again, that's not just the world. That mentality, and that's what Paul predicts, that mentality has penetrated the church. We're more interested in building a church than we are in living for Christ. Man, that's sad.
It is sad. Yeah. So that's where we are.
Yeah. And
it's up to us, and you know, doing these kind of things to just even bring the idea up to our church. You know, our church culture. Right. Because sometimes I think that they haven't even asked the question or realized that it's happening. They don't see that sleight of hand all the time. Because I didn't, you know. And once you do see it, it kind of makes everything else make sense, you know.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome description, because, you know, the whole point of the sleight of hand is that the other half of that is distraction. So again, we're over here worried about the nuclear bombs and worried about the biological weapons and the chemical weapons.
Right.
And Satan's over here saying, yeah, keep looking at that stuff.
It's keep like a card trick or something.
Exactly. Keep looking over there, because don't pay attention to the man behind the screen. Look at all this.
broader sense, that's how I kind of have started looking at eternity. Don't think about eternity. Think about insurance. You got to think about retirement. Oh, you lost your job. You need to put in some of that 401k money. You know?
Absolutely.
That's what I've been thinking. It's like, man, they don't talk about eternity anymore. They don't talk about consequence.
No.
You know, after you're dead, they don't talk about it.
No. The investment is not in the eternal things. You're exactly right. And that's that whole distraction sleight of hand. I love that. That's exactly right.